This wasn't just a family crisis, it was a slow-burn Hollywood implosion hiding in plain sight, and almost no one saw it coming. Long before police reports, court documents, or whispered headlines, the first warning signs were already there, quietly buried beneath the polished image of one of Hollywood's most respected families. From the outside, the Reiner name symbolized stability, creativity, and legacy. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was an institution, a man whose work shaped generations of audiences, whose reputation suggested control, discipline, and emotional intelligence. But inside that world lived a story far more fragile, one that rarely survives the glow of fame. Nick Reiner grew up surrounded by privilege most people only see on screen. Private schools, famous dinner guests, film sets that felt like second homes. Yet those closest to him say the spotlight that lifted his father slowly cast a shadow over him. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The kind of shadow that doesn't announce itself, it just lingers. From an early age, Nick was described as sensitive, deeply emotional, and creative in ways that didn't always fit neatly into expectations. While Rob thrived on structure and control, Nick moved through the world absorbing everything, often feeling more than he could explain. This is where the story first fractures. Because in Hollywood, pressure doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from comparison. Every step Nick took was measured against a name he didn't choose, but could never escape. Friends recall how even casual conversations would drift back to his father's success. A joke here, a reference there. Over time, those moments stacked up. Not enough to explode, but enough to erode something slowly. By his late teens, those around Nick began noticing emotional swings that felt heavier than typical rebellion. He wasn't just moody. He was overwhelmed, detached one moment, intense the next. People assumed it was growing pains, the pressure of privilege, maybe even artistic temperament. But insiders now say those were early signs of something deeper, something that didn't yet have a name, but already had consequences. What made this especially complicated was how help arrived. Rob Reiner, by all accounts, tried. He believed in action, solutions, fixing problems through structure. Therapy appointments were arranged. Rehab stays followed. Family interventions happened behind closed doors. But he erased the contradiction that would define their relationship. Nick didn't want to be fixed. He wanted to be understood. And that difference, small on paper, became enormous in real life. This is where many stories like this go wrong. Because from the outside, it looked like love. Resources were endless. Support systems existed. But emotionally, Nick felt unseen. He once reportedly told a friend that it felt like his father loved a version of him that existed on paper, not the one actually struggling. And that feeling of being managed instead of heard planted resentment that never fully surfaced, but never left either. By the time Nick entered adulthood, his battles became harder to hide. Substance abuse followed. Rehab stays stacked up. Not once or twice, but repeatedly. Each attempt at recovery came with hope, and each setback chipped away at whatever stability remained. At one point, Nick reportedly referred to himself as broken, a word that would echo quietly through everything that followed. He erased the part that most people miss. Through all of this, Nick still admired his father. He studied his films, quoted his dialogue, even modeled some of his own creative ideas after Rob's storytelling style. Love and resentment didn't cancel each other out, they coexisted, feeding off the same emotional wound. And that contradiction became the emotional engine driving everything forward. By the time doctors later diagnosed Nick with schizoaffective disorder, a complex condition blending mood instability with disconnection from reality, the pieces began aligning in ways that felt unsettling in hindsight. What once looked like erratic behavior now carried a different weight. The swings, the detachment, the intensity, none of it came from nowhere. And yet, even with that diagnosis, the story still wasn't finished forming. Because mental illness alone doesn't explain everything. It explains vulnerability, not direction. It explains fragility, not what pushed someone toward a breaking point. That question remained unanswered. And the truth is, the most dangerous moments in this story didn't come from chaos. They came from silence. Because while the world saw a famous family holding together, something underneath was already coming apart, and the people closest to it didn't realize how close it was to collapsing. By the time Nick Reiner entered his late 20s, the cracks beneath the spotlight had widened into something far more dangerous. This was no longer a quiet struggle playing out behind closed doors. The warning signs were visible now, not just to family, but to doctors, friends, and anyone paying close enough attention. And yet, somehow, the descent continued without interruption. About a month before everything unraveled, Nick's treatment plan reportedly changed. Doctors adjusted his medication, attempting to stabilize symptoms that had grown increasingly difficult to manage. On paper, it was a routine clinical decision. In reality, it became a turning point. Those close to Nick say the side effects hit fast and hard. Weight gain, emotional numbness, a sense of losing control over his own body. For someone already fighting to feel like himself, the changes felt suffocating. That's when frustration turned into defiance. According to multiple sources, Nick began resisting the medication. Not openly at first. Missed doses, inconsistent intake, then eventually stopping altogether. People around him noticed the shift almost immediately. His mood became unpredictable. His energy spiked and crashed without warning. Conversations stopped making sense, and the emotional chaos that once simmered quietly began boiling over. This is where hindsight becomes cruel, because now, every moment looks like a warning. But at the time, it was interpreted as something else. Stress, burnout, another setback in a long recovery journey. The problem was that Nick wasn't just relapsing emotionally, he was unraveling cognitively. The line between reality and perception was starting to blur. There were also whispers, never confirmed, but never dismissed, that Nick may have returned to substances during this period. His history made the possibility impossible to ignore. 18 rehab stays. Years spent fighting addiction like a revolving door he could never fully close. If medication instability collided with relapse, the result would have been devastating. A perfect storm for someone already struggling to stay grounded. Friends described Nick during this time as both restless and withdrawn. He talked rapidly, then disappeared for days. He became fixated on ideas that didn't fully connect. He expressed resentment had never voiced before, not loudly, but sharply. Small comments about control, about being managed, about his life not belonging to him anymore. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Inside the Reiner family's Brentwood mansion, a $13.5 million symbol of success and security tension was reportedly escalating. People close to the situation say Nick wasn't just unstable. He was detached, as if he were operating inside a private narrative no one else could access. Conversations looped. Emotions swung violently. And yet, outwardly, life continued. That disconnect is what makes this phase so disturbing. Because it wasn't sudden chaos. It was a slow erosion of reality, happening in real time, while everyone assumed there would be more chances to intervene later. There weren't. After the incident, the one that would shatter the Reiner family's image forever, new information began surfacing about Nick's mental state leading up to that night. Experts reviewing the case reportedly raised serious concerns about his fitness to participate in legal proceedings. He was described as confused, disoriented, unaware of the severity of what had occurred. Right now, Nick remains held without bail at the Twin Towers Correctional Facility in Los Angeles. No plea, no arraignment, no clear timeline. His original attorney, Alan Jackson, quietly stepped away from the case in early January, replaced by a public defender. That shift alone raised eyebrows, because high-profile cases rarely take that turn unless something is deeply wrong. Those closest to Nick describe him now as existing in fragments, unable to fully grasp the situation, unable to explain his own actions, trapped in a mental state that makes intent nearly impossible to measure. And yet, questions remain, because mental illness explains vulnerability, but it doesn't explain motive. It doesn't explain timing. And it doesn't explain the emotional undertones that had been building for years between father and son. That's where the next layer begins. Because while doctors, lawyers, and family members were focused on Nick's symptoms, someone else may have been paying attention to his story. Someone who didn't want to fix him. Someone who wanted to listen. And that presence, quiet at first, would change everything.
You know, Billy Crystal and Robin Williams, I mean, whoever it was, and when Albert would start, That if everybody cleared the floor and they let him go, because it was like genius.
As investigators began peeling back the layers of Nick Reiner's life, the story stopped looking like a solitary collapse and started resembling something far more complicated. Because while doctors focused on diagnoses and lawyers focused on liability, a quieter question emerged: was Nick truly alone in his unraveling, or had someone been standing close enough to shape it? The first unsettling clue came from a place no one expected: a notebook recovered from Nick's former Malibu apartment. At first glance, it looked unremarkable: worn pages, disorganized handwriting. But as analysts flipped through it, patterns appeared: erratic sketches, fragmented sentences, sudden shifts in tone. One page read like guilt, the next like resentment. Several entries referenced family, legacy, and a sense of being used for someone else's story. To investigators, it wasn't just a journal. It was a map of a deteriorating inner world. What stood out most were cryptic mentions of conversations, private discussions that didn't involve family or doctors. Phrases like "he listens" and "he understands the truth" appeared repeatedly, without names attached. At the time, no one knew what to make of it. But that changed when a neighbor from the Brentwood area came forward. According to that neighbor, Nick had been meeting with a man late at night near the gated property weeks before the incident. The conversations were tense, quiet, intentional. Surveillance footage later confirmed the meetings. Two figures, minimal movement, long pauses, no audio, just enough to raise serious questions. This is where the investigation shifted. Detectives began tracing Nick's recent communications: texts, emails, voice messages, looking for anyone outside his immediate circle. What they found wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Long conversations about creativity, identity, being misunderstood. Messages that didn't challenge Nick's thinking, they validated it. And for someone in Nick's mental state, that validation was powerful. One digital message sent to a friend stood out: "Sometimes I feel like my life isn't even mine anymore. Like I'm just acting in someone else's movie." Investigators read that line repeatedly, not because it was threatening, but because it revealed something deeper. Nick wasn't just angry. He felt erased. That feeling became a recurring theme. Around this same time, an old rehab counselor came forward with a troubling recollection. Years earlier, Nick had expressed fears about being watched, followed, managed behind the scenes. At the time, it was dismissed as paranoia, a symptom. But now, investigators were re-examining those statements. Not because they believed them literally, but because someone might have been feeding into them. This is where context becomes everything. Nick had spent years surrounded by people trying to fix him: doctors, therapists, family. What he hadn't had was someone who simply listened, or appeared to. Someone who didn't interrupt with solutions or consequences. Someone who framed his pain as truth rather than illness. That kind of influence doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be consistent. As more messages surfaced, a pattern formed. The unknown individual never contradicted Nick's resentment, never grounded his thinking, never redirected him toward reality. Instead, they reinforced the narrative that Nick was misunderstood, unheard, and justified in his anger. To investigators, this raised a chilling possibility. Not manipulation in the traditional sense, but emotional steering. Guiding someone already unstable toward a version of reality where resentment feels righteous and isolation feels earned. Meanwhile, the Reiner family remained silent. No interviews, no statements beyond legal necessities. Hollywood insiders whispered that tensions behind the scenes had grown worse in recent months, particularly as Nick tried distancing himself from his father's influence creatively and emotionally. And then came another discovery: voice recordings stored in Nick's cloud account, late-night memos, rambling thoughts, moments of eerie calm followed by sudden emotional spikes. In one recording, Nick says, "He wants me to forgive him, but he never really saw me." The identity of he wasn't confirmed, but investigators had little doubt who it referenced. More troubling was what followed: faint background sounds, footsteps, a door, and in a few recordings, what sounded like another voice. Too quiet to identify, but present. Now, everything had changed. The story was no longer about whether Nick Reiner had deteriorated mentally. That was clear. The real question became whether someone had been close enough to shape how that deterioration unfolded, and whether critical warnings were missed because everyone assumed the danger came only from within. Because when someone is fragile, the most dangerous influence isn't force, it's affirmation. And whoever had been listening to Nick during those final weeks may have understood that better than anyone else.
Yeah. And one time at a party, he goes and everybody's hysterical laughing. He finishes, and then he can't stay at the party.
By the time investigators reconstructed the final days leading up to the incident, one thing became painfully clear. This was not a sudden explosion. It was the end of a long, quiet buildup that had been accelerating unnoticed. Every missed warning, every unanswered message, every assumption that there would be more time, all of it converged into a single, irreversible moment inside the Brentwood mansion. In the days before everything collapsed, Nick Reiner's behavior reportedly grew more erratic and inward. Those who encountered him described a man drifting between agitation and eerie calm. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't frantic. He seemed detached, as if he had already accepted a version of events no one else could see. That emotional flatness alarmed professionals later reviewing the case, because it often appears right before a psychological break fully crystallizes. Inside the house, tension lingered like static. Conversations between Nick and his parents were described as circular, repeating the same emotional patterns without resolution. Rob Reiner, according to sources close to the family, was still trying to help in the only way he knew how: structure, logic, solutions. But by then, Nick wasn't processing logic. He was processing meaning. And every attempt to guide him felt, in his mind, like another attempt to control him. This is where the tragedy deepens, because there were signs that Nick wasn't acting with clear intent. After the incident, those who interacted with him described profound confusion. He reportedly showed little understanding of what had happened or why authorities were involved. Medical experts quickly raised concerns about his competency, halting legal proceedings almost immediately. No plea was entered. No arraignment followed. The system itself paused, unsure how to proceed. That pause spoke volumes. Nick was transferred to the Twin Towers Correctional Facility without bail, not because of a clear narrative of guilt, but because the situation defied clean explanation. His longtime attorney stepping away only reinforced what experts already suspected: this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about accountability. It was about capacity. As detectives continued digging, the emotional context of that night grew heavier. The resentment Nick had carried for years didn't explode outward in rage, it folded inward into detachment. The feeling of being unseen, of living inside someone else's story, of never quite belonging, even in his own family. What's most haunting is that, according to those close to the Reiners, love was still present. This wasn't a household filled with hatred. It was one filled with miscommunication, exhaustion, and emotional distance that neither side knew how to cross. A father trying to save his son, a son trying to exist as himself, both believing they were doing the right thing, neither realizing how far apart they drifted. When the night ended, nothing was resolved. There was no clarity, no closure, only shock, confusion, and the sudden collapse of a family narrative the public had never questioned. And that may be the hardest truth to accept, because this story isn't about villains or heroes. It's about what happens when mental illness, identity, legacy, and silence intersect, and no one knows which voice to listen to anymore. The investigation continues. The legal process remains suspended, and the unanswered questions linger heavier than any verdict ever could. When you strip away the headlines, the speculation, and the shock, what remains in the Nick Reiner story is something deeply human and deeply unsettling. This wasn't just a Hollywood scandal or a family crisis. It was a quiet failure of understanding that unfolded over years, not days. A reminder that privilege doesn't protect against pain, it often hides it. Nick wasn't simply rebelling against his father, and Rob Reiner wasn't an uncaring parent. They were two people speaking entirely different emotional languages, both convinced they were acting out of love. One tried to fix, the other wanted to be seen. And somewhere between those intentions, connection was lost. What makes this case linger isn't just what happened inside that mansion, it's what didn't happen beforehand. The conversations that never landed. The warning signs interpreted too late. The assumption that support automatically equals understanding. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all remains unanswered. If someone had truly listened without trying to solve, correct, or control, would this story have ended differently? That question doesn't just belong to the Reiners. It belongs to anyone who's ever mistaken silence for stability. If you want to keep exploring the real stories behind Hollywood's most misunderstood moments, subscribe, because some truths only surface when we slow down enough to really look.